Hi, Henning.
How are you?
I'm great.
So, should we start this conversation?
Yeah, let's do it.
I
Demo
thought
it.
I thought we start with something that introduces the general topic,
Okay.
which is the laboratory, or rather, experimental practices and their extension to the everyday. I think we both share the idea
We think we do. That's why we're here,
that
right?
the laboratory is a sort of radical modern uh, space of knowledge in that it combines humans and machines, organisms and mechanisms, bodies and technologies, and combines and contrasts them with one another in order to produce scientific facts. Now, this institution, the laboratory, although it appears strikingly modern, as you know, has a long history. And
Absolutely.
it,
That's why I have that degree.
and it at least goes back to the early modern period, and where laboratories were used by alchemists, apothecaries, and so on. And it's only in the context of the 19th century, that it really becomes a sort of modern shape, and that laboratories for sort of physics, biology, chemistry, and so on were created. I'm not going to, obviously, not going to rehearse all of this,
No.
but I think it's important to keep in mind that the laboratory is an institution that sort of is not a stable entity, but has undergone significant historical changes and is still in development. One could perhaps even say that today, if you look at current research, what we witness is that the laboratory itself is sort of in a process of dissolution and dispersal. Think of sort of big projects, Human Genome Project or particle accelerators, etc., where the laboratory is not anymore confined to this image that we all have in mind, the sort of the scientist standing at the bench, looking through a microscope, pointing at a screen, and so on.
Right.
Although this iconography of the laboratory was quite successful, we all sort of associate our notion with modern science with these images. It probably not anymore reflects the essential reality of the laboratory. What we are sort of against this background now try to do in this conversation, or rather in this sort of mutual presentation, I think, is to add to this picture in referring to two examples that we both think are sort of telling in that they extend the notion of laboratory and sort of experimentation to the more broader realm of culture, society, and so on.
Absolutely.
And let me mention, just for the sake of being complete, the two examples we're talking about. This is one, the psychiatric clinic laboratory in Cours-Cheverny in France. And this is two, the media lab at the MIT in Cambridge, Mass.
Yep.
And without further ado, I think we just start
Great.
with your part. And
Yeah.
then I have the pleasure to listen to you and then jump in later.
Yeah, so I think in creating this conversation, we wanted to, I think, introduce each other to some ideas or work. So the entire title of this little talk made me think of this ad: in a clear new world, you can see far into the present. The latest in smart tech sales pitches, mainly the SAP ad. And there seems to be something happening with this eternal now, this long now, this future that is here but never arriving, this present we can see so deeply into. And it seems in my head linked to two other things in my mind that I want us to be thinking about in terms of the laboratory. And particularly I'm interested in the question between the forms of performativity around maybe it's knowledge production, maybe it's something else, the demo, and the other demos, which is democracy, and the kind of history of laboratory spaces in relationship to certain forms of governmentality. So this SAP, which is a major kind of software corporation, runs a lot of logistics, is linked in my mind to two other spaces.
It's not working.
Is there some?
No, the other way around. Okay.
Okay. which is mainly the demo, and this is a demo from the Architecture Machine Group to become Media Lab. It's an art installation. You'll learn about it, and you'll find out. And the zone, which is another kind of spatial form of or a new form of territory that's emerging as sort of part of neoliberalism. And both of these today serve as laboratories for rethinking the future of human life and habitation. And I just want to kind of go through a few examples to start our conversation. So this is Songdo in South Korea. I've been working there. This complex is considered a prototype. It's called a test bed. It's, in short, a demo for the future of urban life. Its claim to fame is that it's a smart or ubiquitous city in Korean parlance, and it's part of a new global of infrastructure of spatial products, of what we call spatial products.
I think you better point it out over there, not to the image.
Oh,
rather than
okay.
right.
Sorry. And it's part of this new infrastructure of territories being rolled out and produced by high-tech companies and leveraged through finance capital ranging from India to Ecuador to Africa. And what groups these smart projects, if you will, together along with a series of other sites that I like to think about, such as secure data centers, logistical systems, and ecological preserves, is how all these projects share in imagining the future in terms of apocalyptic or devastating events, whether of terror, informatic or otherwise, economy or environment, and responding to this imaginary almost hopefully, optimistically even, to the ever-increasing application of and intervention into life by computing. In fact, one might say we're speculating on hopes of massive forms of extinction and death, and this has been said. So if there's something really interesting about all this speculation on the end, it is that the end is presumed to never arrive. So when asked about Songdo, engineers and developers called it a test. Literally, this is their language. It's a test. It's an experiment, replicatable. In short, it's a demo.
How many
It's
people are living there?
Right now, only I think about 150,000, but it's slated for 500,000, and they roll these things out. It's the largest real estate development on earth, actually, and the plan is to start these companies that are going to roll these cities for millions of people out in like every year.
Okay.
So anyway, excellent. So, but this is a prototype, and it's already built to fail. In fact, it's failing, but Cisco doesn't care because then they can build another one that's better. It's excellent. So anyway, profit on failure. So I want to think about this, and it's also kind of a data set that is sort of, it's a sensor-filled space that's actually kind of monetizing its population through collecting data. So to think about this, I want to think about the emergence of a new global gospel of smartness and internets of things, and the concept of responsive or smart environment is that led to this is often dated to the 70s and attributed to Nicholas Negroponte's efforts with the Architecture Machine Group. Which later became the Media Lab. So that this language of lab started with these architecture machines. So what kind of architecture machines are these? This idea emerged at the same time of global energy crisis, rising environmental consciousness, and an increase in both urban violence and terrorism, this architecture machine group. So the concept has long been married to catastrophe, and of course it's made famous by Negroponte's famous adage, which is demo or die, the high-tech mantra. And so I'm kind of interested, so what kind of mode of futurity and optimism is being espoused in the name of this impending disaster? And my argument is that what differentiates these contemporary smart infrastructures from earlier histories of knowledge, utopia, and in fact laboratory is not a question of technology, but rather particular forms of spatial and temporal containment and speculation engendered by the logic of prototyping, versioning, and demoing. So the demo is a particular mode of negotiating uncertain futures. It's a different mode of experiment, and it has particular implications for that realm of appearance that constitutes dominant theories of democracy. So it's
demo from demonstrate?
From demonstrate. So the language is the same. And just, I don't know if I should keep going, but just to give you a few examples, let's just go through some demos. Yeah. Let's show the demo. So arguably one of the most important locations that everyone cares about that gave us the idea that the whole world could be interactive is this first computationally immersive environment, which is the Aspen movie map of 1978. And this is kind of a picture of the configuration. It was built through a slow survey of Aspen using gyro-stabilized cameras. That's Andrew Littman. He's a nice guy. I've interviewed him. He took an image every foot traversed down the streets of Aspen, Colorado, which is a fancy ski resort. I've never been there, but you can visit now. It was a system working with laser discs and a computer that could allow a user to traverse the space of Aspen at their leisure and speed. The film was shot back and forward, so you can navigate in reverse, so there's a temporality to the system, and you can place objects in the space. It's an early SketchUp. There's also a scalar component. You can see, as you can see it on the top, the system, so you're simultaneously navigating within 2 scales and multiple times. The effect, Negroponte said, was to have so much recorded that was seamless. And what you're watching now is a demo of the demonstration that this system is possible. It's the last remaining film of it, actually. Okay. So you can't actually experience the system any longer, but you're seeing the demo being enacted here.
Yeah, it was made using a car.
Yeah.
The camera was mounted on a car.
Camera was mounted along a car, and then they took pictures every foot. They actually added animations in as well in order to give. There's all sorts of encoding here about ideas of what they think interactivity or seamless experience would denote, like in terms of time flow.
And the numbers this is a time code.
Yeah, there's all sorts of time codes and also all sorts of ideas here on navigation that you can see. There's no computers to be seen. It's not a model. It is Aspen, as Michael Neimark, an artist who worked on the project, interviewed. Aspen is a verb. It's not a place. It's a way to live. It's a way to be in the world. So originally this fabulous project was actually commissioned by DARPA as a result of inspiration from the military stories of Israeli use of a simulated environment to accomplish the mission of saving hijacked Israeli citizens in Entebbe and Uganda. And so not to be outdone, DARPA thought to do one better and build this entire thing. But it wasn't sure if it would work, so they had to keep demoing it. The project was not classified, however, and this reveals another fact, that Architecture Machine Group at the time was working within a context of the urban riots in the 1960s. And in fact, they're an urban planning school, and most of their projects are urban. So in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination, the increased tensions as white floods urban areas, segregating America's geography, economy, and politics had prompted this sort of new discourse of war in America's cities. At MIT, as a result, urban planners and designers had long turned away from these discourses of social and cognitive to these communication sciences. And they began to deal with these massive systemic problems through these highly interactive demonstration projects, through this sort of through rethinking space through interactivity between agents, and that it had an affective or cognitive character. So there's a kind of a psychologization.
So the purpose was not sort of urban planning or architecture, but it was more sort of controlling the social situation?
Within the situation that this is being built, no, they're not thinking like this at all. They just want interactivity. And it's about better design, and it's about design without architects. It's about democratizing the tools of design. And so one of the things that's interesting about this model that's considered the sort of beginning of first shooter games, Google Earth, responsive environments, was that, of course, it's not the only demo. It's the last of many demos. So demo or die one, it wasn't always a demo. At first, actually, they wanted basically a conversation to develop between architects and computers so that computers could augment architecture. This is Urban 2.5. It was their first demo. They tested it on architects. They're hoping computers could learn from the actions of real people. They would have a conversation. But the whole thing didn't work because, according to Negroponte, it wasn't very fun or full of play. And apparently computers aren't very good with the symbolic part of everything. So let's just get rid of language. And the fact that these demos all failed and no good architectural technologies developed didn't matter, because every failure is just an excuse for the next one. Okay. That's the motto here, demo die too. So they tried out another block world. This is the really good one. Without any anthropocentric conceit, since it seemed that the conversation wasn't going, him and Architecture Machine turned to a new frontier in another microworld titled Seek at the famous software exhibition at the Jewish Museum in 1970. The exhibit consisted of a small group of Mongolian desert gerbils, you can see them cute sitting in there, chosen for their curiosity and inquisitive nature, according to Negroponte, and which were then placed in this environment of plexiglass blocks that was constantly rearranged by a robotic arm. The basic idea was the mechanism would observe the interaction of the gerbils in their habitat, the block, and gradually learn their living preferences by observing their behavior. And the whole thing was staged here at the Jewish Museum. Here you can see the staging of this installation at the Jewish Museum. And here's the catalog. Can't wait to live there. Life in a computerized, and this machine was conceived as a cybernetic world model and a behaviorist laboratory for observation, experimentation, end quote, and that's the Negroponte's discussion.
One question. So the changes of this landscape, they were made sort of randomly?
No, block
Disarmed,
worlds were these
yeah.
like little things. They would just move things according
in
to
a
like
sort of
one
fixed
in a
pattern.
fixed pattern. But
Right.
the thing is, the gerbils were there to introduce chance, the contingency feature, which
Okay.
is what computers aren't that good at.
Right.
So the thing is that the computer was supposed to start like sort of kind of have some memory retention of the way the gerbils were moving the blocks, and then try to sort of increasingly have to act less and less because it would be moving the blocks in ways that were amenable to the gerbils.
Okay.
So this experiment unfortunately went quite badly. The computers filed the show constantly collapsed, the problem being both the software and hardware. The museum almost went bankrupt, and the gerbils in their computer environment might be seen as an omen, or perhaps really should be understood as a simulation we could learn from, wrought havoc on the blocks and ended up getting aggressive, violent, hurting, and even killing each other. No one thought to or could ask whether they want to live in this place, but it doesn't matter, demo or die, now literally. Number 3. Since they tried to make computers smart, but then they gave up because they're like, let's just make people more computer compatible. So then they decided to do these demos of how computers could aid urban design by running Turing-inspired tests on black African-American tenants in Roxbury in the South End. And that these tests are actually all run through a person. They're not actually through a computer because there's no computer technology good enough to do this. So the whole thing is just to prove why we need computers in planning, and that people will be more honest with the computer and that you can get it. So the demo here becomes a difference assimilating machine for negotiating sociological problems through demonstration, and kind of encouraging a particular technocratic answer.
Yeah.
So this brings me back to, so very soon thereafter, so it's kind of a difference consuming machine. So demo or die, a few years later, as they continually move into the environment, they move from architecture machine group to the media lab. And the front and center of the media lab is this media room, which is kind of this total environment where it's immersively connected to the user. And you kind of, and it'll be, according to Negroponte, responsive, individuality, and excitement. And this sort of immersive environment is the one in which our final, in which this is staged as a kind of culminating.
Where it's projected, right? Okay. Okay.
So the interesting thing is the way that kind of architecture becomes media. The idea of the lab sort of expands both into the world and brings it down, and then the way that social questions become these issues of kind of interactivity and demonstration.
Nice.
So
Yeah, good. Okay.
that's what I have to show.
Thank you. Okay.
And we'll just leave that running. People can just
no.
yeah.
Perhaps you can find my first image.
Yeah.
No, this way. This
Oh,
way.
God.
So,
No, I just wanted us to contemplate all the other possibilities in architecture.
okay. Oh, okay. Here we go. Okay, now on to something completely
Touching
different,
again.
as they say.
Awesome.
So it's really something completely different. This clinic, Laborde, it was founded in 1951 by a psychiatrist called Jean Orit, and it's not very well known actually. The clinic, not as well known as the MIT Media Lab, right? But it's of key importance for the establishment in the French context of what is called institutional psychotherapy. And this is a specific approach of treating psychiatric patients, combining psychopharmacology, phenomenological psychiatry, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. And the clinic was founded in 1951, as I just said, and was founded by Jean Orit, who sort of 2 years later brought in Félix Guattari as his co-director. And there was a rough sort of division of labor between the two. Orit was dealing with the medical stuff, whereas Guattari was in charge of organizing this sort of everyday of the clinic. And I actually like to approach the clinic as if I was a new arrival in this institution. And this is actually the cover of a sort of booklet that was handed to patients who were new and arrived there. It's from 1994, so not really from the beginning, but it gives you a sort of impression of the exterior of the clinic. It's a sort of old castle that they have bought, and it was transformed into this clinic. And what you can read there is something like, you just arrived in Laborde, perhaps you feel a little lost, and this booklet is meant to help you. And if you leaf through the booklet, the next thing you will see is is this right here? Is this working now? Here we go, is a map of the terrain of the clinic, of the area that the clinic covers. And what you can see there is it's not just the castle that is part of the clinic. There are lots of other buildings, in part for the administration, but in part also for the medical treatment. But what you can also see is they have sort of stuff like horse stables, chicken houses, they have a theater, they have an assembly room, they have a library, and it's all sort of distributed, sort of module-like in this area, in this gigantic park that is surrounded.
Is this unusual for?
Surrounding the clinic. It's not perhaps really unusual. I've not been to a lot of psychiatric hospitals on the countryside, but it's obvious this is not at all a laboratory. It does not resemble a laboratory that you can find in sort of a center of the city. It's not a modern sort of facility. It is more evocative of like a field station, perhaps, or perhaps even a farm. Now, the two things are important to understand how the clinic functioned and is still functioning. First, it actively integrates the patients into its operation, meaning it does not reduce them to the roles of sort of suffering beings, but rather patients are allotted specific tasks. For example, operating the telephone office, working in the administration, cooking, etc. Secondly, the non-medical staff has a system of rotating through the various sort of areas of the clinic. They are not only administering medicine, they're also sort of offering workshops for the patients. They are sort of doing sports, various kind of things that they take care of. The background to this is the understanding that the institution is an important element of therapeutical work. So against the entire idea of Italian anti-psychiatry, those people are convinced that the institution in itself is not harmful. Rather, they're convinced it's an important tool for actually conducting the therapeutical work they're doing. And under one condition, which is that this institutional space is kept open and flexible, and hence the sort of the rotation idea, hence the sort of module-like offer of sort of various buildings where you could do different things. And you can also see at this point already, if you talk about the institution in that way, the questions of architecture are sort of waiting around the corner. Guattari was mainly in charge of organizing the sort of the non-medical program of the clinic. And this included, as I just said, artistic activities, quite a lot of them actually. And it went so far as to include even filmmaking. And here's an excerpt of an animation that was done by patients in Laborde in the 1960s. I'm not going to show the animation, Les Dents du Serge. I'm just going to show you the introduction to this, where you can see the sort of clinic, and you can also see the young Guattari working.
So wait, is the clinic still kind of maintaining that sort of, because this
Sure.
is 94, so they're
Sure.
kind of
1994,
maintaining the same kind of programs that Guattari started?
Oh no, it's not coming. We don't have the movie.
Oh no.
It's perhaps mixed up.
Did you put the file?
Oh, here it is.
Here it is. It's okay.
So the director of the movie is René Laloux, who was, afterwards made a sort of important career as a director of animations. And this is sort of, the surrounding of the clinic. We don't need sound because it's has subtitles. There's not so much happening, somebody's playing music, and you see a sort of countryside feeling it has.
Did they discuss anything about sort of the place? Like, did Guattari talk about what he thought art would do in relation to, or what he understood?
No, he's the man that in the late 1960s brings in architects and urban planners to discuss the problem. Where can we create spaces for psychiatric patients that are appropriate to their needs? So they're not at all thinking about, as the Italian do, thinking about giving up on the institution as such.
Right.
This is the main building. Well, this takes long, so I probably just
I'm curious about the film itself. Was it treated as a kind of or not just experiment in sort of therapy, but also was it some sort of like, not data gathering in a conventional sense, but that it was seen as part of like a therapeutic experiment? Or
that's a very good question, my dear. Because
The
it
answer is yes.
is exactly what I'm sort of interested in, and what I'm fascinated with is they were using technologies, also media technologies, in their therapeutical work. So there is a sort of case that Guattari is talking about, where one of the patients in Laborde sees himself on screen, which at that time, when case history is written, 1955, probably not a TV screen, but rather this kind of screen. And he describes the effects that the patient has in terms of the sort of mirror stage that Lacan talks about. He also uses tape recordings in his therapeutical works and tries to sort of, create a situation that is far away from the classical setup of psychoanalysis, and it's much more experimental.
Well, it makes me think a little bit of someone else who was working at MIT at the time, actually in the then media, well, what was to become the Media Lab, which was Stan Vanderbeek, who had this idea of...
That's Guattari,
Oh,
actually. In his 20s, in his late 20s.
It's not our place to explain.
Yeah.
There you have it.
Yeah, okay.
No labs for us.
So, and the striking thing is, that's the picture that is before that. He himself describes a lot of his work as experimental.
Right.
Actually, I was struck when, going back again to his texts, also the stuff he wrote together with Deleuze, seeing how much emphasis is placed on experimentation. And my argument would be it goes back to this sort of institutional context that is very open to sort of innovations and bringing in sort of creativity, artistic potentials in order to create new therapeutical situations. Now, the clinic director, Uri, would never accept the term experimentation for his work, but still, Guattari, I think, happily embraced it. And this also is clear from his own kind of, the way he proceeded. That's the other image that I was going to show, his sort of involvement in a radio station where he would show up. He sort of used technical media all over the place. He organized exhibits. He was a lot of on TV. He wrote scripts for movies. And so there is a sort of explorative and experimental side to his work that is reflected in his statements about experimentation that you find in his works with Deleuze and in other places. Yeah.
I mean, no. Well, what's interesting here is also this issue of whether the question of the laboratory is as much about the modes of truth claim and the kind of organization of power relations, I guess. And I mean, did you have? I don't want to cut you off.
No, sure. Go ahead.
Great things to say.
No. But if you, I have a quote here from him, where he sort of draws a parallel between artistic experimentation and scientific experimentation.
Oh, really? Could you read it?
It's a rhetorical question, but I think the point is quite clear. He says, cannot technical and scientific setups be assimilated on many points to aesthetic performances? And symmetrically, aren't works of art constructed in the same way as experiments? See, and I think he's coming very close to things that are going on right now. If you think of Bruno Latour and his interest in sort of the instauration of works in various domains, be it art, be it technology, be it science, here you have somebody who sort of 10 years earlier is already interested in, pointing to the potential parallels between what he calls the performative acts in science, technology, and the arts.
Well, what's both compelling about that, and for me of concern, is actually the question of difference.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, for the Media Lab, that's also true. Like the
Right.
idea was to bring together, right, all the mediums. And originally, the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which was the arts sector, was part of this kind of constellation. And it's only actually in the 80s that Media Lab only starts in the 80s, but very soon thereeafter, Otto Pien splits off. And that was around military funding and the organization of the institution. And so then this comes into questions about how do we understand the conditions of possibility for encouraging different modes of experimentation that do not all kind of collapse. Because today, obviously, Media Lab being the prototype, design and architecture and the arts, we're supposed to humanize computing, and in that way every single smart city is got some like mega architect and tons of installation art. Like they launched Songdo with all these art, so it's kind of a complicated question.
But do they use the term experiment or experimentation? I mean, they talk of demos.
That's an interesting question about the transformation from demo, although Negroponte still used the words like a behaviorist experiment for this art project. So I think that the two kind of blend together. I think in corpo speak, nothing's an experiment. And so I think the interesting question is how to reinvigorate the question of experimentation and failure in some sort of ethically challenging way, because the point of the demo and the test bed in engineering is that every failure is only an argument for the next version.
Okay.
So there's something happening about the stakes of what you're discovering. I don't know.
You mind if I talk a little bit about the architectural machines?
Yeah.
That's the movie. We don't want to have that again. Here.
Oh, I actually had, and before we saw the image of the floating Tokyo pictures.
Right.
From Arata Sozaki.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's hard to flip back and forth, but if you can recall, there were kind of these floating cities hovering over Tokyo. They were kind of a predecessor metabolist to then the later Takamatsu, who does these.
There are two
machines.
things that Guattari is interested in when he talks about Takamatsu's architectural machines. It's first, obviously, the sort of machine-like design of those structures. But it's also Takamatsu's use of architecture as a machine in order to construct himself as an architect, right? And that's actually, his sort of key point, and I think also key for understanding his notion of experimentation. I think his understanding is that it's an open process that results not only in an object, like in a building, as this one, but also sort of has a huge impact on the subject, on the architect himself. So it's sort of the two sides that are in some sort of performative process emerge. And this, I think, is his point about experimentation in architecture, right?
Well, I think what's interesting,
and coming back to this image that you have shown about this sort of Japanese
Isozaki,
architecture, he argues that Takamatsu, by using architecture as a machine, as a sort of experiment to invent himself, sets himself off from other Japanese traditions or sort of tendencies, contemporary sort of ways of doing architecture. He's interested in what he calls Takamatsu's singularity, right?
Right.
So,
There's, I'm not going to enter debates about, but I like
Right.
the general question of the architecture machine, though, and I think it is about his singularity, but in many ways his convergence with other modalities of architecture like Media Lab and Isazaki. So some of these people were trained, aside from a genealogical actual relationship, which is one of the reasons I bought the Metabolist, because Isazaki came through MIT in the 50s,
Okay.
and so this kind of technological, but it kind of took the imaginary in a slightly different way.
Okay.
And so one of the questions about both Takamatsu and Negroponte is the way that they formalize the process, the demo, so that the process I went through was also a process of training architects, where you start with an effort to introduce computing aided design into architecture, and the idea was that it would be a conversation, and it ends up with this idea of total immersive interactivity, but also increasingly the question of this kind of unending and unfolding architecture is a constant interest in documenting process itself. And so the very practices of finding out about what works and what doesn't and how you build it becomes this self-construction as I don't even want to call it observer anymore, or individual or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think what's interesting is the question of when that gets fully automated or becomes technically closed, and when it's left open.
Yeah.
And I feel like Guattari struggled a little bit with Takamatsu about trying to figure out how he both he was intrigued by the kind of singularity of his vision, but understood at the same time that so much of it could.
I don't know.
Or
I mean, he
maybe
went
anticipated
to
everything.
Japan several times. He talked to him several times. Sure, he's not an expert in architecture, but one thing that he was, constantly trying to find out in his conversations with Takamatsu is, I think, how what he calls the architectural object is actually taking off. How it, and he was very much interested in the details of, Takamatsu's work, meaning that, Takamatsu is not working with a computer in the beginning. And Guattari was interested in the fact that first there is a phase of sort of, drawing on your sort of fantasy and on your imaginary. And this is a process, according to Guattari and Takamatsu, it takes place with, ink on paper. And then there is a second phase where he's trying to get, to work against the grain of these imaginary ideas about a project that is very much done with pencil. And he describes it as a work of repetition and sort of selecting and introducing mutations, but getting away from the imaginary, right? And then, once the object has emerged, there is a final work of sort of harmonizing and sort of adapting to functional needs and so on. So perhaps it's also a question, in the different way, to understand the difference between those two architectural machines, or the two understandings of architectural machines, is also important how the process of constructing those machines are conceptualized on the one side and the other, right?
I think so, and I also think it's, for me, the problem with the demo at an ethical and political level in relation to this other problem with the demos is precisely the fact that it enters into the site of emergence, which is always the kind of issues you have between that sketch moment, like all this kind of repetition with differentiation that has to happen when you sketch, experiment, and then have to deal with the building, and then these incommensurabilities between all these different spaces. And one of the things that this current demo notion does is it precisely extracts that moment of incommensurability as the site where you continue to monetize and legitimate the next. That is the process, is like constantly seeking that difference. So I don't know where that.
So it's also perhaps a question: where is the other in the demo, right?
Yeah.
I mean, where is the what's the exterior, or where is the resistance coming up, and how is it taken into account? I mean, how much demos have to? How much failure has there to be in a demo in order to start
When
with a
it
new
folds.
demo, right?
Yeah.
So, but do they talk about this?
Well, I think it comes up. I mean, there's places like the Seek. I gave that example of the gerbils because that's a kind of beautiful example about the kind of negative potentialities, but still potentiality in the demo. Like the system radically didn't perform in any mode, and its logic was taken to kind of a certain extreme. And one of the questions is sort of, how do those logics get pushed into ways that don't automatically return to a kind of nihilistic
Okay.
part? I
Okay.
mean, so I don't know if there's an
Okay.
answer. You're like,
Yeah. Okay. So I think
we've solved.
I think we're many questions have been sort of raised, but not all of them have been answered. But
That's fine.
I very much enjoyed talking to you,
It was a pleasure.
and so I would say, I don't know. See you around.
Yeah, exactly. It's been wonderful. It's been real. In the words of the late Arthur Whitehead. So we're done.